The 2023 NFL season was a very interesting one. This season had rookies completely transforming their teams from the bottom feeders of the NFL to serious playoff contenders, and even veterans that were sitting on their couch also leading their team to the playoffs. There were many different storylines this season. Some were very positive and gave franchises a bright future. For others, they were filled with disappointment. In this video, I want to talk about what I think are the 4 best and most interesting storylines that happened in this 2023 NFL season. Brock Purdy and the 49ers. Last year, Brock Purdy and the 49ers made it all the way to the conference championship, but they got blown out by the Eagles. The 49ers ended the season on a really bad note. And on top of that, everyone, and I mean everyone, believed that what Brock Purdy did that year was a complete fluke. What are the chances that what Mr. Irrelevant, the player that scouts deemed as the worst quarterback in that draft, did in 2022, he would do again in 2023? And to be honest, this question was a pretty reasonable question. However, the thing that people didn't realize is that scouts can be wrong, and other times, extremely wrong. The 2023 season was a very big year for the 49ers, and more specifically Brock Purdy. Early on in the season, Cam Newton came out and labeled Brock Purdy nothing more than a game manager.
These are game managers. They're not difference makers.
Many people said that any success that Purdy found wasn't because he was good. It was because his team was good. All eyes were on Purdy, and he did quite alright, bringing the 49ers all the way to the Super Bowl with some MVP caliber numbers. But it wasn't just the numbers, because this season Purdy also showed us that he wasn't just an average backup quarterback. He was actually capable of leading the team towards winning games. I think the biggest testament to this was in the NFC Conference Championship against the Lions. Going into the second half, the 49ers were losing 24-7, but Brock Purdy led them all the way to completing a 17-point comeback and winning 34-31. And in the Super Bowl, Purdy actually held his own against the Chiefs and their elite defense, throwing for almost 300 yards and a touchdown. Even though it might not have ended how the 49ers would have liked, there is no doubt that Brock Purdy is their guy, and he's actually capable of being something more than a game manager. CJ Stroud and the Texans. CJ Stroud was drafted as a 2nd overall pick in the 2023 NFL Draft. He was seen as the 2nd best quarterback in that draft, behind Bryce Young. That still may or may not be true, but when that happened, Bryce was sent to one of the worst situations in the NFL, and CJ was sent to one of the best. The Texans were coming off a really bad season where they had a record of 3-13-1, one of the worst teams in the NFL at the time. But they got a new coach, new players, already had a pretty good O-line, and a fresh new quarterback. CJ Stroud had everything lined up perfectly for him to be able to succeed. And yeah, CJ was a 2nd overall pick, but still, I don't think anyone expected just how good he would be from the very beginning. In just his 2nd game against their divisional rivals, the Colts, Stroud threw for almost 400 yards and 2 touchdowns. He was playing pretty well to start the season, but there was one game in particular that made everyone hear CJ's name. In Week 9 versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the Texans were trailing 33-37 with 46 seconds left in the game. They had to drive 75 yards down the field if they wanted to win, and that's exactly what CJ did. CJ completed all 5 of his throws and led the Texans to completing a game-winning drive. The Texans barely won that game 39-37. Stroud completed 30 of his 42 passes for 470 yards, 5 touchdowns, and no interceptions. Stroud was almost perfect, and after this game, everyone realized that Stroud was something special. The Texans ended the regular season strongly with a 10-7 record and secured a spot in the playoffs. And all that momentum that the Texans had in the regular season translated to the postseason. In the wild card, the Texans would be facing the Browns. CJ completed 16 of his 21 passes for 3 touchdowns and no turnovers, and would blow out the Browns 45-14. And just like that, CJ won his first ever playoff game and became the youngest quarterback to ever do so. However, they would lose to the number 1 seeded Ravens in the next round, but I don't think that really mattered. In just 1 year, CJ Stroud had completely turned around the franchise, from being one of the worst teams in the NFL for a good amount of years, to now leading the Texans to a 10-7 record and even winning the wildcard game. The Texans might have lost in a divisional round, but the future is looking very bright for Houston. CJ was very fun to watch this season, and there's no doubt that he'll be really good. Joe FLACCO. I think that by far the most unexpected thing that happened this season is the re-emergence of Joe FLACCO. To start the year, FLACCO wasn't part of any team. He was a free agent just sitting on a couch watching football. Before week 11 of the season, Deshaun Watson had suffered a shoulder injury and had to undergo surgery that would knock him out for the rest of the season. The Browns had to rely on their backup quarterback. That is, until he also got injured just 2 games later, and that's when Flacco got the call to suit up and come play for the Browns. The 38-year-old Flacco was back on the team, but the thing is that the Browns had a really good defense, one of the best in the entire league. The defense was doing their part every single game, and even though the offense was missing a lot of firepower, Flacco had to come in and do his part. Flacco's first game would come in week 13 versus the Rams. He threw for over 250 yards and 2 touchdowns, but also 1 interception, and the Browns lost that game 36-19. But after that, they went on a 4-game winning streak, and Flacco threw for over 300 yards in all of those games. He even threw 3 touchdowns against the Jets, Texans, and the Jaguars. To say Flacco had just come from sitting on his couch to now clinching a playoff spot with the Browns, he was doing really well. But during the 5 games that Flacco played in the regular season, he had one big problem, and that was just how many interceptions he was throwing. He had 13 touchdowns, but also had 8 interceptions. And unfortunately, his poor decision making would come back to bite him in the playoffs. The Browns would face the Texans in the wild card. They had faced off just a couple weeks ago in the regular season and actually beat them 36-22, but that was when the Texans didn't have CJ Stroud. In the second half of the wild card game, the Browns had the ball and were trailing 14-24. The game was definitely still winnable, but after Flacco threw a really bad pick 6, the score was 14-31. The Browns got the ball back for another chance, but yet again, Flacco threw another pick 6, and that basically called game. Even though Flacco didn't really win anything except a few regular season games, it's still crazy that he was able to pull that off at 38 years old after not having played for a while. It was fun seeing Flacco in a short stint, but in the end, Flacco's turnovers caught up to him and costed the Browns a loss in the wild card. Dan Campbell and the Lions. Last year, the Lions started off with a record of 1-6 to begin the season, but after that they completely turned it around and ended with a record of 9-8. However, their losses in the beginning of the season came back to bite them as they failed to make the playoffs, but they ended the season with a lot of momentum, and everyone knew that the Lions would be way better in 2023. The first game of the season would be a tough one. The Lions were facing the defending Super Bowl champions, the Chiefs. The game was close, but in the end, the Lions actually scraped out a 21-20 win and made a statement that this year could actually be their year. And one of the reasons they ended up doing so well this season was because how many risky calls Dan Campbell, the Lions head coach, made this season. A good indicator of this is the fact that the Lions had the second most 4th down attempts in the entire league this year, only behind the Panthers. The Lions had an impressive record of 11-4 going to week 17, and they were fighting for the number 1 seed. They would be facing the Cowboys, who were also fighting for the number 1 seed. In the game, both teams went back and forth. Jared Goff and the Lions drove down the field and with 23 seconds left, scored a touchdown. With the score being 19-20, Dan Campbell could either just kick the field goal and send the game to overtime, or go for 2 points and try to win it. And I think you can guess which one he chose. But Dan wasn't going to go for his 2-point conversion without a special play. Goff snapped the ball, dropped back in the pocket, and threw it to the offensive tackle Taylor Decker, and he made the catch. But that's when Roger Goodell made the call. The refs called the play back because supposedly Decker didn't report as eligible to the referees, even though Decker said he did, and there's even a video of him talking to the referee before the play. The Lions went for 2 again, failed it, but went for it a 3rd time after the Cowboys got flagged, and they failed again. Do you understand how confident you have to be to go for a 2-point conversion 3 times in a row? Everyone already knew Dan Campbell took a lot of risky plays, but after this game, many people started to question why he would go to that extent and not just kick the field goal. But even though losing this game caused the Lions to lose the number 1 seed and home field advantage, they still secured a spot in the playoffs and barely beat the Rams 24-23 in the wild card, which gave the Lions their first playoff victory in 32 years. The Lions then beat Tampa Bay in the divisional round and made it all the way to the conference championship against the 49ers. In the first half, the Lions were actually cooking the 49ers. They were up 24-7 going into halftime, and that dream of making it to the first ever Super Bowl in franchise history was very real. The 49ers received the ball in the second half, drove down the field, and scored a field goal. The Lions then got the ball and drove down the field, but instead of kicking a field goal on the 4th down, you definitely know what Dan Campbell decided to do. It actually would have worked and probably changed the outcome of the game if Josh Reynolds hadn't dropped the ball. But in the 4th quarter, the Lions had another chance to kick a field goal on 4th down that would have tied them. but instead they went for it and failed to convert. Eventually, the 49ers would complete a 17-point comeback and outscore the Lions 34-31 and secure their spot in the Super Bowl. You know, it's kind of poetic. The same sword that Dan used to bring him all the way to the conference championship was the same sword that cost him the game. But even though the Lions did have a disappointing end, to say the season was a failure would be very wrong. Dan Campbell has proved to be a great head coach and a great leader. Dan reminds me a lot of Sean Payton, who is known for taking risky play calls, and it makes sense because Dan was the assistant head coach behind him in New Orleans. The Lions have a really good team and a really good head coach leading them. We'll just have to see where things go from here. Those were the 4 storylines that I thought were the best and most interesting this season. Even though my team, the Saints, didn't find much success this year, the season was still entertaining, no doubt. If there's any storylines that I missed that you think should have been in here, let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed, make sure to like and subscribe.